Hi, my name is Pete Palumbo, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. In the lovely town of New Canaan, Connecticut, from the 1940s through the 1990s, no one was more influential than architect Philippe C. Johansen. That C stands for Cortelyou, by the way. His internationally famous glass house celebrated its 70th anniversary recently with a huge outdoor party, plus an aerial performance by Philippe Petit. That's the guy who is known for his daring and highly unauthorized wirewalk between the World Trade Center towers back in 1974. New Canaan, Connecticut is full of mid-century modernist architecture from Mr. Johansen, as well as Eliot Noyes, Marcel Breuer, Landis Gores, and John Johansen, collectively known as the Harvard Five, plus other architects such as Edward Durell Stone and James Evans. U.S. Modernist Radio's own George Smart was there at the fancy party in New Canaan. Later, he sat down inside a Johansen house with two people intimately familiar with those houses, Inger Stringfellow and Cristina Ross. We'll hear from them in a moment. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by modernist realtor Angela Roll and Nietzsche.
Beauty, love, durability, designed to last for years to come, bringing you peace and tranquility. You feel relaxed, knowing your house can easily achieve any exterior look and any color. Wood, concrete. Your house loves feeling this good. And you love feeling this good. Nietzsche, 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 Nietzsche. Say it with me. Nietzsche. Advanced engineering. Nietzsche, Nietzsche. Durability, textures, finishes, and colors. Visit Nietzsche.com/US Modernist. Nietzsche, Nietzsche, Nietzsche. That's N-I-C-H. Wait for it. A look you'll love. Nietzsche.
Inger Stringfellow was born in Tonsberg, Norway,
about 65 miles outside of Oslo,
and she grew up in Sydney, Australia,
about 9,900 miles outside of Oslo,
before she moved to the New York area. After high school, she lived and studied in Europe, eventually returning to Manhattan, working for 18 years at the CBS television stations division as head of the National Sales Office. She then moved to New Canaan and has become a leading real estate agent for William Pitt Sotheby's, including several Philip Johansen houses. Architect Cristina Ross has owned a Johansen house and knows the amazing economic impact Johansen and modernism brought over the years as a member of the New Canaan Town Council. Formerly with J.P. Morgan, she's now in private architecture practice and is on the board of trustees for both Cooper Union in New York and the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. She's co-author of the book Mid-Century Houses Today, New Canaan, Connecticut. George, Inger, and Cristina were inside the Johansen-designed 1953 Robert C. Wiley House in New Canaan, Connecticut. George started by asking Cristina about her earliest inspiration for pursuing architecture.
To be perfectly honest, it was the Brady Bunch.
Oh, tell me more.
It was that first house and the way that the house presented. And I lived in a Queen Anne house in Queens, New York, and I thought that was just an unbelievable space because it was so open and airy, and he was an architect. And that's what
Mr. Brady, Mike Brady.
Yes, and that's what started my curiosity to look further into architecture. And before I knew it, I was in drafting classes, and then I was serious enough to attend Cooper Union, and that's where I went to architecture school. So it took me through the whole process, and it just started with that particular show that I had seen as a kid. Then I was lucky enough when I was at Cooper Union to meet Philippe Johnson, and he made quite an impression on us. This is right at the time that he was building the AT&T building on
What year
Madison
was that
Avenue.
about?
I think that was about 1976, if I'm not mistaken. And Johnson was also commissioned to do the lipstick building, also on Madison Avenue. And we spent over a period of 2 years seeing him on and off when he would come to the crits at the studio at the end of the year. And he was just wonderful with the students. Many years later, after I graduated and been practicing for a few years, my husband and I looked to move to the country. And we were advised to look at New Canaan. And we looked at New Canaan, fell in love with the town, and moved here. And lo and behold, this is where the Glass House is. And I've seen Philip, ran into him in many of the restaurants in town, had brief conversations about this or that. And then he was building the gates to the Glass House property, and shortly after that he was building the visitors building, which is the Monster. So we had the opportunity to talk, and it was just very heartwarming to have that connection. When a property came up on the market and I was thinking developing, my good friend Pretty Paris called me up and she said, I know this is not exactly what you were looking for, but I think you need to come out and see this property. And I was staying a little bit away mid-century modern New Canaan because there had been so much controversy about them in terms of the preservation or not, and many people felt that tearing them down was the best option. So I went to see the house, and
Yeah, during the 80s and 90s, there was a big anti-sentiment against these houses.
yes, well, there's been an anti-sentiment in New Canaan since the time they were built. They were very controversial.
Really?
The Harvard Five, as they were known, and then associated architects of that era, were not very welcome in our town. Even though they graduated from Harvard or Yale or large schools, the locals would say in the local paper that they should take their packing boxes and leave. Because it really...
Get out of town.
Yes, exactly. In the most poetic way, because they would insult each other in poems at that point, as quaint as it sounds. And
in the paper, right? They would write letters to the editor.
Yes, yes.
And they would give these kind of lyrical insults to each other.
Yes, and the architects would respond and the locals would attack, and it went back and forth for many years. So after these houses began to show their wear, and because many of the materials used were common materials. I remember John Blackley, who was a professor at Yale, who was an architect here, describing how he used the tennis tops to do the walls, to give it a different finish, to give it a different look. Sheetrock was just being created at that time. He proposed that it would be 3 feet wide instead of the 4 foot wide that it came out. The Celanese company had just come out with linoleum and linoleum tiles, and there were many products. Armstrong was coming out with acoustical ceilings. There were so many products coming out, but in New Canaan there was a slight problem. Even though Philip had just worked on the Seagram's building, there wasn't the quality of craftsmanship to build the houses out in the country that you had in the city. So he talked the Howell and Company to building us a satellite office here in New Canaan, and they moved a couple of their major people here so that they could manage the budding business of architecture that was happening here in New Canaan. And there were a total of, I think, about 118 houses here in New Canaan, of which we just have slightly under 100 that have survived. And it's just amazing to have that cluster of housing here. But the truth of the matter is the materials that we're using were just materials that were coming out, or materials that were not used in construction that are being used in a different way.
Okay.
So the longevity of the house may not be as long as a colonial for some, depending on how they were constructed. But for Johnson, he used masonry materials, and he used wire lath and plaster and very high-end products. So you had the longevity that many other houses didn't afford. And when I walked into the property, I just fell in love with it because I saw that the possibility was that somebody would buy it and knock it down. And I saw the possibilities of building in the back and preserving it as a satellite building to the main building. And it took a long time to get the town to approve that permit, not because it wasn't allowed by zoning, but because the perception still was that they could take another one down. So the New York Times wrote an article about it 3 years later that turned it around, and the town then came back and offered to give me the permit. And it was a difficult journey, but I think that all in all, the life that I spent living in that house for 10 years was very rewarding because it showed me the difference between living in a very open space, that it's open both visually to the outside, that embraced everything around it. I didn't have to go to television to see what the weather was going to be or to see if it was raining outside. All I had to look was through the wall because it was all glass. So you fall in love with that, and it's hard to go back to colonial houses with windows and solid walls because It's a totally different environment.
Inger, you've been in real estate how long now?
Almost 20 years.
20 years.
Yeah, actually.
So you picked it up right when modernism was coming back in New Canaan?
It was. I actually had a neighbor who actually took a modern and renovated it, and he was really inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. And I happened to be the fourth broker, and, it had been on the market, and it wasn't necessarily appreciated because it was very different, but it had the sort of a beautiful terrace cantilevered over a river. And he taught me a lot, and I didn't know an awful lot about it. I knew that it appealed to me, the aesthetics of it. So he taught me a lot, and I developed
Was he like your Yoda?
He was my Yoda.
Yoda?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, yeah.
The modernist
and he and his
Yoda?
Wife, yes, he and his wife, who was also an architect. And he said, you've got a real passion and enthusiasm for these. So I managed to find the perfect buyer for it. And ironically, everybody thought because it was cantilevered over the river and it was a little bit hazardous with this terrace, that it would be sort of an adult couple. Well, ironically, it was a young family with one small toddler, a baby, and they ended up having one more. And they are still there, and they love it. And so he and his wife said, you really should make this your niche market. So I went back to my manager, and he said, I don't think that market is large enough. I think it's too restrictive, and you shouldn't restrict yourself that way. Well, I didn't really listen to him, so they recommended me to one of their friends who had a very unusual one with a hyperbolic paraboloid roof.
Is this the James Evans house?
The James Evans house,
yeah.
Correct.
Is he still around?
He is still around. He's in his early 90s, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, and he's still practicing. A lovely man.
Okay.
And this is a very unusual house in the fact that the whole first floor had the hyperbolic paraboloid roof, and none of the walls went to the ceiling. And it was not in very good shape either. But, it had a lot of interest. So while I had a lot of interest in it, nobody bought it, but I managed to find them other houses. So it ended up being that I was able to establish a clientele representing buyers and sellers of these moderns.
Yeah, the hyperbolic paraboloid house, for those of you that don't know what that is, imagine a Pringles potato chip where the saddle of it in the middle and then it flips up at the sides, and now make those angles a little bit sharper, and you have the idea of what the roof looks like. Yeah. Very few of these created in the United States. The first one, I believe, was in 1954 in Raleigh, North Carolina by Eduardo Catalano, a house that very near and dear to us that was unfortunately destroyed in 2001.
Wow.
But James Evans' house is still going.
Yeah,
and
it's still going.
Did it eventually change hands?
No. And actually the owner, I think, he really doesn't want to part with it. So it's been on the market for years. He rents it out. It's in not very good shape. The windows are all single pane. But what is interesting about these modern houses, that they were beautifully sited. And so they would take advantage, the bedrooms were on the north side, the living areas were the south and western, you had the big eaves. So they were sort of passive solar houses. So even though they were single panes, it wasn't necessarily, the sun would warm them. A little bit similar to the Alice Ball house with the single, the sun would come in, and it would warm the stone floors, right. And it would sort of maintain its heat throughout the day.
Now, Christina's an architect.
Yes.
Is everybody cut out for this? I mean, what do you need to be to live in a modernist house? Because I don't think they're for everybody.
No, they're not for everybody. And I think, people look at them visually and they look in these shelter magazines and they see all this beautiful aesthetic. But it's really is a lifestyle. You cannot necessarily have a lot of stuff. It's a pared down existence. I think a little bit, I don't want to say disciplined in a negative way, but I think everything has its place. And I think a lot of people, they want all the modern amenities. They want the yoga studio, they want the home theater, all of those things. You can't get all of those in these
photography studios.
Oh yes,
kids' playrooms.
Yeah. So,
but as much as people fall in love with them, they readapt and they build modern. And I think that's been the greatest asset, that this keeps on going. And they build, the bedrooms are not as small as they were designed in mid-century houses. And the newer houses have bigger rooms and more storage.
Bigger kitchens, too.
Yes, exactly. But that flavor of the family room, integrating the family room into the kitchen, all came out and was born out of the mid-century houses. As a matter of fact, John Black Lee took credit for inventing the family room with the kitchen because he did it first before anybody else did it.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, Frank Lloyd Wright takes credit for the open floor plan.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I was with Roland Risley, who's one of the last living clients of Wright. And he said he asked Wright one time what he thought his greatest contribution was to architecture. And he said it was the open plan.
Really?
Might not have been true, but that's what Wright said at the time.
Well, no, it might be true because he influenced everybody, including the Bauhaus, in terms of his design. And he spent a great deal of time in Europe teaching his philosophy and writing books, which I'm still trying to find.
To get a hold of.
Yes.
I noticed a big change because it was around 2003, 2004 when I was representing this cellar. And, all of a sudden you could see the change in the shelter magazines, that things were paring down, that was going away from the florals and the heavy
Laura Ashley period.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of helped. Also the fact when the Glass House opened in 2007, that really sort of put a spotlight on moderns in general and New Canaan in particular.
And Dwell was in full gear by then.
Absolutely.
And they were featuring these kinds of houses every month.
Yeah.
I don't remember what year Dwell came out, but Metropolitan Home has started to feature mid-century moderns. And I purchased the Philip Johnson house in 2005. Mm-hmm. And he passed away 3 months before I closed on it. So it was a period in which it was just a resurgence. And I think you're right. It was about the time that Johnson died that there was a great deal of recognition. And then when the Glass House opened, it was just the right time. Everything seemed to converge into realizing the value of these homes and the design.
We were talking about before with, a lot of these were torn down. These architects, a lot of them did not have a lot of money. Philip Johnson was, obviously did have some. A lot of these were not custom. They built for themselves. They were experimental. So because of that, they weren't necessarily the best materials. But the interesting thing is they were very clever. And because land was cheap, and especially here in New Canaan, they were usually built on beautiful pieces of land. And not your typical what people want today. They don't want just a square, flat piece of land. They were interesting pieces. They were rocky, they were high elevations or overlooking mature lands, mature trees. And then when people would want to buy one of these and then to expand them to adapt to today's lifestyle, they wouldn't fit in with the current zoning regulations. And so they would say, okay, well, you already got your footprint and the coverage, so you need to put a second floor on it. But, well, that was contradictory to what these houses were all about. So a lot of times then, these houses were torn down just purely because they sat on such beautiful prime pieces of land. Fortunately, we had somebody who was a Hungarian architect, who was a modernist, who actually was on our planning and zoning, who said, we are really doing the community a disservice by allowing this. We've got to sort of protect, and we've got to allow some of them to have some variances to adapt, so that these can be preserved and yet upgraded, to accommodate today's lifestyle. So,
one of the things that was very common during the 40s, 50s, I think it stopped around the 60s, early 70s when modernism declined, was that having a landscape architect was a typical part of everybody's budget.
Yeah.
It wasn't just calling Home Depot and having some bushes delivered. It was actually having somebody as part of the design team
I was going to say,
crafting how the property would look. So if you had a great looking lot already, it would be enhanced even more with berms, for instance, or other ways of shaping the land around the house, just making fascinating combinations.
Right. Yeah. Well, they were integrated, as you say, in the design process. Yeah.
You bought this house, which is called the Alice Ball House.
Yes.
And you closed on it, and you moved in. And how was it? Was it like a big surprise? Was there stuff to fix? Or what was your experience of getting in there for the first time?
Well, the house was very dated, and I moved my office in there. And it was basically my office, my guest house, and it had an addition. So my first quest was to find out more about the history of the house, and I found out that the second owners to the property had called Johnson and said to him, we don't have a garage. And he said, I didn't think of it. So he designed a garage, and he liked the shape and the house so much that he repeated that design in 2 other houses in New Canaan. And basically the house lent itself to a very period type of living. And I wasn't living in that period, so I had more things. I needed more space.
You had stuff to take care of, right?
Yes. So the idea of expanding and the idea of thinking of the back of the property to build a house just began to formalize itself in terms of what I would do and how I would go about it. In that, I discovered more and more of what Philip Johnson did and how traditional he was in his design. Although it was modern, it was rooted on a lot of formalized historical approach to architecture.
So were you designing a modern house addition for the property?
No, because at that time, more so than now, moderns didn't sell. It was very difficult to sell a modern. So I was going for a more European traditional house in the back with the modern in the front of the property that would be turned into a guest house or a pool house or something like that.
What happened? Did you build the new house?
No, I ended up selling the property. The market collapsed in 2008, so I restored the property, and then we put it on the market, and Inger here sold the property.
Okay.
With my friend Prudy Paris, who was the person who identified the property for you.
Yes.
What kind of people come to New Canaan now to move into moderns? I mean, are they coming from out of the country? Are they coming from New York City? Who's buying the houses here?
I think everything. I think we do get some people locally from within New Canaan, but I would say a lot of people from New York City, some people from Los Angeles, and we do get people from overseas.
I think one of the most interesting pieces of history that really surprised me is the people that were moving to New Canaan that demanded, I want a modern, were the movers and shakers of major corporations. The head of Mobil, the head of Standard Oil, the CEO of IBM. It was amazing. These were not your run-of-the-mill everyday people. These were people that even though they could have whatever they wanted, they were looking to be on the cutting edge of that time.
Yeah, the cutting edge.
It was very fashionable to go in that direction.
Yes. And
because these houses were often expensive to build, that was not an issue for them.
But that is interesting because the way in which the architects compensated to bring the house within an acceptable economic level is they would reduce the size of the house. So instead of having a very large room, in terms of bedrooms, they would just downsize them enough to have the bed, the night table, and the closets, and everything would be built in so that you wouldn't have the necessity to have a lot of furniture and a lot of clutter. So that's another evolution in the design of these houses, that even though they were done for the most affluent, they were still minimalist in terms of the design. And I found that very interesting.
Since modernism has been appreciated again in New Canaan, have people been building new houses here that are modern?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So what kind of architects are coming into town?
Well, I think there's a lot. Some international ones, some local ones. We have some where they have taken part of the original and, like for example, the Eliot Noyes house up on Cross Ridge, where they renovated the whole thing. They took it, demolished it, and rebuilt it with the same premise, and then put on an extra story, but then preserved the original pool house by Eliot Noyes. And that was actually a local Greenwich architect and a local builder.
Okay.
So, and now the person who bought the Alice Ball house he actually worked with Richard Meyer, Roger Ferris, and now has his own firm, and basically he's based out of Shanghai, New York and Shanghai, but he spends more time, and he does a lot of international projects.
And he's designed a master plan for that house, right?
Exactly.
How does that work?
Well, originally his inspiration was really the Smith House by Richard Meyer, which is
in Darien.
In Darien,
yeah.
Correct. But when he realized that it was sort of a 3-story tower, if you will, it would basically be looking down on the roof of the Alice Ball house, which certainly was not the most interesting part of the Alice Ball house. And so he came up with a new concept, and this is a very low-slung house that is actually named the Wall House, which is basically paying homage to the Alice Ball house, and with the public rooms overlooking that, and then the private quarters sort of a half a story up and sort of tucked away in the back. And, it's very complimentary. It doesn't take away at all from the Alice Ball house. And he's done incredible plans that have all been approved by the town. The engineering, it's all done. He's done a very extensive book on this whole thing, so it's ready to go. Unfortunately, his wife unexpectedly had twins. He's spending more time in China than he thought, and his wife just does not want to take on the project. So at this point, because he actually designed it for himself and his family, and so at this point he's decided that he's going to offer this. He will build it for somebody else. He's also a car collector, so he had designed it to have a garage underneath that will have a lift that takes the cars down.
How many cars can you fit down there?
He can fit about 15.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Sounds like Jay Leno should buy a place here.
Well,
he's
maybe.
A car collector.
He is a car collector, yes, yeah. We have a number of them, so... Anyway, it just, but it's hard. I think it's been a difficult time economically for people. We went, after 2008, it took us a number of years to rebound. And I think the times, and it was almost like people shied away from conspicuous consumption. And I think that's sort of gone away a little bit now, and people are not afraid to, spend the money and show the wealth and what have you. But, and again, I think there's some tremendous values here in New Canaan. It's being offered at just under $8 million. If it were in the Hamptons or Los Angeles, it would be 30.
Well, we'll talk about this house in a second. Where are you now? Are you in a little tiny modernist house somewhere with all your stuff in storage somewhere in a storage unit?
No. I'm in New Canaan in a traditional colonial.
Okay. With all your stuff still, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So you didn't really shift into that lifestyle so much as she was talking about earlier of paring down when you get into
I
new
did.
house.
No, I did.
You did? Okay.
Yes, because I had both houses simultaneously.
She didn't give up the one.
She did.
Yeah.
You had a backup house.
Yes, I had a backup house. So I have now the backup house with the colonial furniture and some modern mixed in.
Okay. So do people come to you and ask about modern design for your projects?
Yes.
What kind of projects are you doing?
I do commercial and I do educational, and really it's a multifaceted practice. So it depends on what comes along that I'm interested in or I'm inspired to do.
What's your favorite project right now?
A legal office in New York.
Is it in a tall building or?
Yes, it's in a major skyscraper.
Okay. And you're retrofitting it how on the inside?
Modern.
Modern, okay.
A lot of glass.
A lot of glass. So is it one of the 60s ones that had the curtain wall already, or is it older?
No, as a matter of fact, I did one of those. It was the Time Life building at Rockefeller Center a few years ago, and I did the Time magazine layout, and it was very time capsule. Mm-hmm. The original walls, almost demountable in a way, and the original carpets and the furniture, everything was still there. And we took it back and modernized it, but took away that 1960s look because it wasn't in at the time, and replaced it with a lot of glass. So it's very much in style to what's coming back.
I've talked with a lot of people who work in very modern offices, mm-hmm. And there's not that same kind of issue that is there in houses with people's stuff, because in an office, you're more digital.
Correct.
So you don't have to have the file rooms that you used to have in the 50s and 60s with thousands or hundreds of thousands of files and clerks to go through and pull the files from all that. It's not the paper-intensive world that we had before. So you can move in and give somebody a drawer and a couple of screens and a desk and a great view, and you're good.
Absolutely.
Now, is there any inspiration that you get from modern in designing common spaces for offices? Because that's really big now. An office has a little coffee shop, and it has a little hangout area, it has a little living room.
The space is now more designed for a style of living, more so than just the efficiency of the work. They want to make sure that their employees are comfortable, and there's a breakout room, and those amenities that weren't as important in years past have come front and center now.
I'm glad to see that cubes have gone away, largely.
Yeah.
Are we over cubes in offices? Are we done?
I think so.
Is anybody putting those in?
No, not necessarily. I see more open space and more raw space being designed, especially in downtown Manhattan.
Okay. Ingrid, tell us about the house that we're in. This is another Philip Johnson house.
Yes, it is, yeah. It was built for a real estate developer, Mr. Wiley. It was built in 1953. They approached Philip Johnson to design this, and actually Philip Johnson selected the site for the Wileys, and because it reminded him of the topography of the glass house, but also the stand of hickory trees. And there was also an old barn here, which appealed to Philip. So he designed this, and this, I think, is most like his own glass house in the fact that it's got this glass cube for the public rooms sitting on a base of a stone plinth where you have the bedrooms. And again, because of the topography of the land, all the bedrooms on the lower level open out to the grounds.
And so there's a house here, which is the cube that
Right.
people will see. All the houses we're talking about today you can find at usmodernist.org/pjohnson, and you'll see the cube when you type in Wiley or search for that. But tell us more about the building in the back and the pool house.
So the original structure was the glass cube on the solid base, and then these cantilevered terraces on either side. And then the circular pool, which is very similar to the one. It's not a deep pool, it's sort of oval and very shallow, and you sort of have to step onto a little pad in order to go down a little ladder.
Like a bird bath almost
like
for people.
Exactly, a bird bath for people. That's exactly it. I haven't heard that. This current owner did an extensive renovation of the original house. He upgraded the amenities. He put in air conditioning, put in new windows, etc. And at that time also dug partially underground to put in a pool house, and then created some stone walls for some privacy. They took down the old barn and reconstructed a very large barn, actually, because the current owner is a very significant art collector, and he needed a temperature-controlled place for his artwork.
And in case you're thinking of robbing the house, there are machine gun turrets all around the property, so do not come on the property. Thank you very much.
And then they did some extensive landscaping here, so...
Okay.
Now, actually, interestingly enough, Philip Johnson had designed something for a renovated barn to be a studio, but this owner chose to go with Roger Ferris, and it was a multi-year project here.
Now, I understand this house is for sale, and it's a real deal.
It is an incredible deal for somebody. Yes, it is. Yeah. When we first put it on the market, it came on at like $14 million. And when I went through it with the foreman who had done the renovation, he said the owner had more than that in the renovation project alone. It's been some challenging years. We've had some interested showings, and it is not sold. So now it is at a bargain price of $7.5
Half price, folks.
Half
Come on,
price.
half price.
You know, the owner is a little bit of a private person, so he does not allow, tours, which is good and bad to that, because there are people who will come on these tours of the glass house and all the Philip Johnson properties, of which we, by the way, have 6 here. But he has now recently allowed some photo shoots, so we are actually sort of seeing an uptick in some of the interest, and so we can see the clicks online. So it's getting some interest. So hopefully its time has come, as they say.
So my last question to both of you, we'll start with Cristina, is what is your advice to first-time rookie modernist home buyers?
I think that you have to buy a house that you fall in love with. It has to talk to you. Of the many people that I know that own moderns, their story always starts with, I walked in and I fell in love. I saw the possibilities. And when you have that kind of feeling about a house, it's all good after that.
And you want both spouses to feel this, right?
Well, I don't know. That's between them.
Inger, what about you? What's your advice to first-time modernist home buyers?
Go to a specialist real estate agent who understands and knows moderns, because there's a very big differential between moderns and contemporaries. Go to somebody who is knowledgeable and knows about them. And, a lot of the owners, I'm acquainted with a lot of them who don't necessarily haven't put them on the market yet, but say, if the appropriate buyer comes along, I would consider selling it. So I think it pays for the consumer to deal with somebody who knows the market in general.
And Inger's not saying that just because she is a specialist real estate in modern. What also happens is that many realtors aren't into modern much at all. Mm-hmm. They would prefer not to deal with it. They're not particularly passionate about it. It represents a lot of challenges and problems they may not want to deal with.
Right.
So working with somebody who knows their stuff is good advice.
And also that you can steer them to the correct resources that, to address some of these, because there's some people say, well, flat roofs, you got to run away. Now the flat roofs, the technology is so different than it was before. So.
And with rubber membranes, most of the buildings in America are flat roofs. They're fine.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for this conversation. This has been a blast, and it's been so fun to see this house.
Well, good. I'm so glad. And so you're going to see another one, I understand.
I'll be going to the Philip Johnson Glass House this weekend for their annual summer gala. I will not be recording a show there, but I hope to have some photos of that up on Instagram.
Good.
Yes.
Well, we'll follow you on Instagram and likewise.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Nichiha.com/US Modernist and by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for Modernist houses. 919-995-0550. Okay, Tom?
Visit usmodernist.org's massive modernist archives to hear past shows, discover 7,000 mid-century houses, and access 2.6 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. Get a hold of George at usmodernist.org or via Instagram at mr.modernism. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Our esteemed guests get thoroughly Googled by Chief Researcher Cindy Stratton, not her real name, from her secret underground bunker. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another rambling, far-traveling episode of U.S. Modernist Radio.